Chapters 27 and 28 of Beautiful Joe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Allyson Hester of Athens, Georgia. Beautiful Joe by Marshall Saunders. Chapter 27. A Neglected Stable. I had not been on the ground more than a few seconds before I turned my eyes from Miss Laura to the log hut. It was deathly quiet. There was not a sound coming from it, but the air was full of queer smells, and I was so uneasy that I could not lie still. There was something the matter with Fleetfoot, too. He was pawing the ground and whinnying and looking, not after Mr. Harry, but toward the log building.
"Joe,"
said Miss Laura,
"what is the matter with you and Fleetfoot? Why don't you stand still? Is there any stranger about?"
And she peered out of the buggy. I knew there was something wrong somewhere, but I didn't know what it was, so I stretched myself up on the step of the buggy and licked her hand, and barking to ask her to excuse me, I ran off to the other side of the log hut. There was a door there, but it was closed and propped firmly up by a plank that I could not move, scratch as hard as I liked. I was determined to get in, so I jumped against the door and tore and bit at the plank till Miss Laura came to help me.
"You won't find anything but rats in that ramshackle old place, Beautiful Joe,"
she said as she pulled the plank away.
"and as you don't hurt them, I don't see what you want to get in for. However, you're a sensible dog, and usually have a reason for having your own way, so I am going to let you have it."
The plank fell down as she spoke, and she pulled open the rough door and looked in. There was no window inside, only the light that streamed through the door, so for an instant she could see nothing.
"Is anyone in here?"
she asked in her clear, sweet voice. There was no answer except a low moaning sound.
"Why, some poor creature is in trouble, Joe,"
said Miss Laura cheerfully.
"Let us see what it is,"
and she stepped inside. I shall never forget seeing my dear Laura going into that wet and filthy log house, holding up her white dress in her hands, her face a picture of pain and horror. There were two rough stalls in it, and in the first one was tied a cow, with a calf lying beside her. I could never have believed, if I had not seen it with my own eyes, that an animal could get so thin as that cow was. Her backbone rose up high and sharp, her hip bones stuck way out, and all her body seemed shrunken in. There were sores on her sides, and the smell from her stall was terrible. Miss Laura gave one cry of pity, then with a very pale face, she dropped her dress, and seizing a little penknife from her pocket, she hacked at the rope that tied the cow to the manger, and cut it so the cow could lie down. The first thing the poor cow did was to lick her calf, but it was quite dead. I used to think Jenkins' cows were thin enough, but he never had one that looked like this. Her head was like the head of a skeleton, and her eyes had such a famished look that I turned away, sick at heart, to think she had suffered so. When the cow lay down, the moaning noise stopped, for she had been making it. Miss Laura ran outdoors, snatched a handful of grass, and took it in to her. The cow ate it gratefully, but slowly, for her strength seemed all gone. Miss Laura then went into the other stall to see if there was any creature there. There had been a horse. There was now a lean, gaunt-looking animal lying on the ground that seemed as if he was dead. There was a heavy rope knotted round his neck and fastened to his empty rack. Miss Laura stepped carefully between his feet, cut the rope, and going outside the stall, spoke kindly to him. He moved his ears slightly, raised his head, tried to get up, fell back again, tried again, and succeeded in staggering outdoors after Miss Laura, who kept encouraging him, and then he fell down on the grass. Fleetfoot stared at the miserable-looking creature as if he did not know what it was. The horse had no sores on his body as the cow had, nor was he quite so lean, but he was the weakest, most distressed-looking animal that I ever saw. The flies settled on him, and Miss Laura had to keep driving them away. He was a white horse with some kind of pale-colored eyes, and whenever he turned them on Miss Laura, she would look away. She did not cry, as she often did over the sick and suffering animals. This seemed too bad for tears. She just hovered over that poor horse with her face as white as her dress and an expression of fright in her eyes. Oh, how dirty he was! I would never have imagined that a horse could get in such a condition. All this had only taken a few minutes, and just after she got the horse out, Mr. Harry appeared. He came out of the house with a slow step that quickened to a run when he saw Miss Laura. "Laura!" he exclaimed, "what are you doing?" Then he stopped and looked at the horse, not in amazement, but very sorrowfully. "Barron is gone," he said, and crumpling up a piece of paper, he put it in his pocket. "What is to be done for these animals? There is a cow, isn't there?" He stepped to the door of the log hut, glanced in, and said quickly, "Do you feel able to drive home?" "Yes," said Miss Laura. "You sure?" and he eyed her anxiously. "Yes, yes," she returned. "What shall I get?" "Just tell father that Barron has run away and left a starving pig, cow, and horse. There's not a thing to eat here. He'll know what to do. I'll drive you to the road." Miss Laura got into the buggy, and Mr. Harry jumped in after her. He drove her to the road and put down the bars. Then he said, "Go straight on. You'll be on the open road, and there's nothing to harm you. Joe will look after you. Meanwhile, I'll go back to the house and heat some water." Miss Laura let Fleetfoot go as fast as he liked on the way home, and it seemed only minutes before we drove into the yard. Adele came to meet us. "Where's Uncle?" asked Miss Laura. "Gone to the big meadow," said Adele. "And Auntie?" "She had the colds and chills and entered into the bed to keep warm. She lose herself in sleep now. You not go near her." "Are there none of the men about?" asked Miss Laura. "No, mademoiselle. They all occupied way off." "Then you help me, Adele, like a good girl," said Miss Laura, hurrying into the house. "We found a sick horse and cow. What shall I take them?" "Nearly all animals like a bran mash," said Adele. "Good!" cried Miss Laura. "That is the very thing. Put in the things to make it, will you please? And I would like some vegetables for the cow. Carrots, turnips, anything you have. Take some of those you have prepared for dinner tomorrow, and please run up to the barn, Adele, and get some hay, and corn and oats. Not much, for we'll be going back again, but hurry, for the poor things are starving. And have you any milk for the pig?
put it in one of those tin kettles with covers."
For a few minutes, Miss Laura and Adele flew about the kitchen. Then we set off again. Miss Laura took me in the buggy, for I was out of breath and wheezing greatly. I had to sit on the seat beside her, for the bottom of the buggy and the back were full of eatables for the poor sick animals. Just as we drove into the road, we met Mr. Wood. "Are you running away with the farm?" he said with a laugh, pointing to the carrot tops that were gaily waving over the dashboard. Miss Laura said a few words to him, and with a very grave face he got in beside her. In a short time we were back on the lonely road. Mr. Harry was waiting at the gate for us, and when he saw Miss Laura, he said, "Why did you come back again? You'll be tired out. This isn't a place for a sensitive girl like you."
"I thought I might be of some use," said she, gently. "So you can," said Mr. Wood. "You go into the house and sit down, and Harry and I will come to you when we want cheering up. What have you been doing, Harry?"
"I've watered them a little. I got a good fire going. I scarcely think the cow will pull through. I think we'll save the horse. I tried to get the cow outdoors, but she can't move."
"Let her alone," said Mr. Wood. "Give her some food and her strength will come to her. What have you got here?"
And he began to take the things out of the buggy.
"Bless the child. She's thought of everything, even the salt. Bring those things into the house, Harry, and we'll make a bran mash."
For more than an hour they were fussing over the animals. Then they came in and sat down. The inside of the Englishman's house was as untidy as the outside. There was no upstairs to it, only one large room with a dirty curtain stretched across it. On one side was a low bed with a heap of clothes on it, a chair, and a washstand. On the other was a stove, a table, a shaky rocking chair that Miss Laura was sitting in, a few hanging shelves with some dishes and books on them, and 2 or 3 small boxes that had evidently been used for seats. On the walls were tacked some pictures of grand houses and ladies and gentlemen in fine clothes, and Miss Laura said that some of them were noble people.
"Well, I'm glad this particular nobleman has left us," said Mr. Wood, seating himself on one of the boxes. "If nobleman he is, I should call him in plain English a scoundrel. Did Harry show you his note?"
"No, uncle," said Miss Laura.
"Read it aloud," said Mr. Wood. "I'd like to hear it again."
Miss Laura read,
"J. Wood, Dear Sir, it is a matter of great regret to me that I am suddenly called away from my place at Penhollow, and will, therefore, not be able to do myself the pleasure of calling you and settling my little account. I sincerely hope that the possession of my livestock, which I make entirely over to you, will more than reimburse you for any trifling expense which you have incurred on my account. If it is any gratification to you to know that you have rendered a slight assistance to the son of one of England's noblest noblemen, you have it. With expressions of the deepest respect, and hoping that my stock may be in good condition when you take possession, I am, dear sir, ever devotedly yours, Howard Algernon Leduc, Baron."
Miss Laura dropped the paper.
"Uncle, did he leave those animals to starve?" "Didn't you notice," said Mr. Wood, grimly, "that there wasn't a wisp of hay inside that shanty, and that where the poor beasts were tied up, the wood was gnawed and bitten by them in their torture for food? Wouldn't he have sent me that note instead of leaving it here on the table, if he'd wanted me to know? The note isn't dated, but I judge he's been gone 5 or 6 days. He has had a spite against me ever since I lent him that $100. I don't know why, for I've stood up for him when others would have run him out of the place. He intended me to come here and find every animal lying dead. He even had a rope around the pig's neck. Harry, my boy, let us go and look after them again. I love a dumb brute too well to let it suffer, but in this case, I'd give $200 more if I could make them live and have Barron know it."
They left the room, and Miss Laura sat turning the sheet of paper over and over with a kind of horror in her face. It was a very dirty piece of paper, and by she made a discovery. She took it in her hand and went outdoors. I am sure that the poor horse lying on the grass knew her. He lifted his head, and what a different expression he had now that his hunger had been partly satisfied. Miss Laura stroked and patted him. Then she called to her cousin. "Harry, will you look at this?" He took the paper from her and said, "That is a crest shining through the different strata of dust and grime, probably that of his own family. We'll have it cleaned, and it will enable us to track the villain. You want him punished, don't you?" he said, with a little sly laugh at Miss Laura. She made a gesture in the direction of the suffering horse, and said frankly, "Yes, I do." "Well, my dear girl," he said, "father and I are with you. If we can hunt Barron down, we'll do it." Then he muttered to himself as she turned away, "She is a real Puritan, gentle and sweet and good, and yet severe. Rewards for the virtuous, punishments for the vicious." And he repeated some poetry. "She was so charitable and so piteous, she would weep if that she saw a mouse, caught in a trap, if it were dead or bled." Miss Laura saw that Mr. Wood and Mr. Harry were doing all that could be done for the cow and the horse, so she wandered down to the hollow at the back of the house where the Englishman had kept his pig. Just now he looked more like a greyhound than a pig. His legs were so long, his nose so sharp, and hunger, instead of making him stupid like the horse and cow, had made him more lively. I think he had probably not suffered so much as they had, or perhaps he had a greater store of fat to nourish him. Mr. Harry said that if he had been a girl, he would have laughed and cried at the same time when he discovered that pig. He must have been asleep or exhausted when he arrived, for there was not a sound out of him. But shortly afterward he had set up a yelling that attracted Mr. Harry's attention and made him run down to him. Mr. Harry said he was raging around his pen, digging the ground with his snout, falling down and getting up again, and by a miracle escaping death by choking from the rope that was tied around his neck. Now that his hunger had been satisfied, he was gazing contentedly at his little trough that was half full of good sweet milk. Mr. Harry said that a starving animal, like a starving person, should only be fed a little at a time. But the Englishman's animals had always been fed poorly, and their stomachs contracted so much so that they could not eat much at one time. Miss Laura got a stick and scratched the poor piggy's back a little, and then she went back to the house. In a short time we went home with Mr. Wood. Mr. Harry was going to stay all night with the sick animals, and his mother would send him things to make him comfortable. She was better by the time we got home, and was horrified to hear the tale of Mr. Barron's neglect. Later in the evening she sent one of the men over with a whole box full of things for her darling boy, and nice hot tea done up for him in a covered dish. When the man came home, he said that Mr. Harry would not sleep in the Englishman's dirty house, but had slung a hammock out under the trees. However, he would not be able to sleep much, for he had his lantern by his side, all ready to jump up and attend to the horse and cow. It was a very lonely place for him out there in the woods, and his mother said she would be glad when the sick animals could be driven to their own farm. End of chapter 27, A Neglected Stable. Chapter 28, The End of the Englishman. In a few days, thanks to Mr. Harry's constant care, the horse and the cow were able to walk. It was a mournful procession that came into the yard at Dingley Farm. The hollow-eyed horse and lean cow and funny little thin pig staggering along in such a shaky fashion. Their hoofs were diseased and had partly rotted away so that they could not walk straight. Though it was only a mile or two from Penhollow to Dingley Farm, they were tired out and dropped down exhausted on their comfortable beds. Miss Laura was so delighted to think they had all lived that she did not know what to do. Her eyes were bright and shining, and she went from one to another with such a happy face. The queer little pig that Mr. Harry had christened Daddy Longlegs had been washed, and he lay on his heap of straw in the corner of his neat little pen and surveyed his clean trough and abundance of food with the air of a prince. Why, he would be clean and dry here, and all his life he had been used to dirty, damp Penhollow, with the trees hanging over him, and his little feet in a mass of filth and dead leaves. Happy little pig, his ugly eyes seemed to blink and gleam with gratitude, and he knew Miss Laura and Mr. Harry as well as I did. His tiny tail was curled so tight that it was almost in a knot. Mr. Wood said that was a sign that he was healthy and happy, and that when poor Daddy was at Penhollow, he had noticed that his tail hung as limp and as loose as the tail of a rat. He came over and leaned over the pen with Miss Laura and had a little talk with her about pigs. He said they were by no means the stupid animals that some people considered them. He had had pigs that were as clever as dogs. One little black pig that he had once sold to a man away back in the country had found its way home, through the woods, across the river, up hill and down dale, and he'd been taken to the place with a bag over his head. Mr. Wood said that he kept that pig because he knew so much. He said the most knowing pigs he ever saw were Canadian pigs. One time he was having a trip on a sailing vessel, and it anchored in a long, narrow harbor in Canada, where the tide came in with a front 4 or 5 feet high, called the Bore. There was a village opposite the place where the ship was anchored, and every day at low tide a number of pigs came down to look for shellfish. Sometimes they went out for half a mile over the mud flats, but always a few minutes before the tide came rushing in, they turned and hurried to the shore. Their instincts warned them that if they stayed any longer, they would be drowned. Mr. Wood had a number of pigs, and after a while Daddy was put in with them, and a fine time he had of it making friends with the other little grunters. They were often let out in the pasture or orchard, and when they were there, I could always single out Daddy from among them, because he was the smartest. Though he had been brought up in such a miserable way, he soon learned to take very good care of himself at Dingley Farm, and it was amusing to see him, when a storm was coming on, running about in a state of great excitement, carrying little bundles of straw in his mouth to make himself a bed. He was a white pig, and was always kept very clean. Mr. Wood said that it is wrong to keep pigs dirty. They like to be clean as well as other animals, and if they were kept so, human beings would not get so many diseases from eating their flesh. The cow, poor unhappy creature, never, as long as she lived on Dingley Farm, lost a strange, melancholy look from her eyes. I have heard it said that animals forget past unhappiness, and perhaps some of them do. I know I have never forgotten my one miserable year with Jenkins, and I have been a sober, thoughtful dog in consequence of it, and not playful like some dogs who have never known what it is to be really unhappy. It always seemed to me that the Englishman's cow was thinking of her poor dead calf, starved to death by her cruel master. She got well herself, and came and went with the other cows, seemingly as happy as they. But often, when I watched her standing and chewing her cud, and looking away in the distance, I could see a difference between her face and the faces of the cows that had always been happy on Dingley Farm. Even the farm hands called her Old Melancholy, and soon she got to be known by that name, or Mel for short. Until she got well, she was put into a cow stable, where Mr. Wood's cows all stood at night upon raised platforms of earth covered over with straw litter, and she was tied with a Dutch halter, so that she could lie down and go to sleep when she wanted to. When she got well, she was put out to pasture with the other cows. The horse they named Scrub, because he could never be, under any circumstance, anything but a broken down, plain looking animal. He was put into the horse stable in a stall next to Fleetfoot, and as the partition was low, they could look over at each other. In time, by dint of much doctoring, Scrub's hoofs became clean and sound, and he was able to do some work. Miss Laura petted him a great deal. She often took out apples to the stable, and Fleetfoot would throw up his beautiful head and look reproachfully over the partition at her, for she always stayed longer with Scrub than with him, and Scrub always got the larger share of whatever good thing was going. Poor old Scrub! I think he loved Miss Laura. He was a stupid sort of a horse, and always acted as if he was blind. He would run his nose up and down the front of her dress, nip at the buttons, and be very happy if he could get a bit of her watch chain between his strong teeth. If he was in the field, he never seemed to know her till she was right under his pale colored eyes. Then he would be delighted to see her. He was not blind, though, for Mr. Wood said he was not. He said he had probably not been an over bright horse to start with, and had been made more dull by cruel usage. As for the Englishman, the master of these animals, a very strange thing happened to him. He came to a terrible end, but for a long time no one knew anything about it. Mr. Wood and Mr. Harry were so very angry with him that they said they would leave no stone unturned to have him punished, or at least to have it known what a villain he was. They sent the paper with the crest on it to Boston. Some people there wrote to England and found out that it was the crest of a noble and highly esteemed family, and some earl was at the head of it. They were all honorable people in this family, except one man, a nephew, not a son, of the late earl. He was the black sheep of them all. As a young man, he had led a wild and wicked life, and had ended by forging the name of one of his friends, so that he was obliged to leave England and take refuge in America. By the description of this man, Mr. Wood knew that he must be Mr. Barron, so he wrote to these English people and told them what a wicked thing their relative had done in leaving his animals to starve. In a short time he got an answer from them, which was, at the same time, very proud and very touching. It came from Mr. Barron's cousin, and he said quite frankly that he knew his relative was a man of evil habits, but it seemed as if nothing could be done to reform him. His family was accustomed to send a quarterly allowance to him on condition that he led a quiet life in some retired place. But their last remittance to him was lying unclaimed in Boston, and they thought he must be dead. Could Mr. Wood tell them anything about him? Mr. Wood looked very thoughtful when he got this letter. Then he said,
Harry, how long is it since Barron ran away?
"About 8 weeks," said Mr. Harry.
That's strange,
said Mr. Wood.
The money these English people sent him would get to Boston just a few days after he left here. He is not the man to leave it long unclaimed. Something must have happened to him. Where do you suppose he would go from Penhollow?
"I have no idea, sir," said Mr. Harry.
And how would he go?
said Mr. Wood.
He did not leave Riverdale Station because he would have been spotted by some of his creditors.
"Perhaps he would cut through the woods to the junction," said Mr. Harry.
Just what he would do,
said Mr. Wood, slapping his knee.
I'll be driving over there tomorrow to see Thompson. I'll make inquiries.
Mr. Harry spoke to his father the next night when he came home, and asked him if he had found out anything.
Only this, said Mr. Wood. There's no one answering to Barron's description who has left Riverdale Junction within a 12-month. He must have struck some other station. We'll let him go. The Lord looks out for fellows like that.
"We will look out for him if he ever comes back to Riverdale," said Mr. Harry quietly. All through the village and in the country it was known what a dastardly trick the Englishman had played, and he would have been roughly handled if he dared return. Months passed away, and nothing was heard of him. Late in the autumn, after Miss Laura and I had gone back to Fairport, Mrs. Wood wrote her about the end of the Englishman. Some Riverdale lads were beating about the woods looking for lost cattle, and in their wanderings came to an old stone quarry that had been disused for years. On one side there was a smooth wall of rock many feet deep. On the other, the ground and rock were broken away, and it was quite easy to get into it. They found that by some means or other, one of their cows had fallen into this deep pit over the steep side of the quarry. Of course, the poor creature was dead, but the boys, out of curiosity, resolved to go down and look at her. They clambered down, found the cow, and, to their horror and amazement, discovered near by the skeleton of a man. There was a heavy walking stick by his side, which they recognized as the one that the Englishman had carried. He was a drinking man, and perhaps he had taken something that he thought would strengthen him for his morning's walk, but which had, on the contrary, bewildered him and made him lose his way and fall into the quarry. Or he might have started before daybreak, and in the darkness have slipped and fallen down this steep wall of rock. One leg was doubled under him, and if he had not been instantly killed by the fall, he must have been so disabled that he could not move. In that lonely place, he would call for help in vain, so he may have perished by the terrible death of starvation, the death he had thought to mete out to his suffering animals. Mrs. Wood said that there never was a sermon preached in Riverdale that had the effect that the death of this wicked man had, and it reminded her of a verse in the Bible. "He made a pit and he digged it, and is fallen into the ditch which he made." Mrs. Wood said that her husband had written about the finding of Mr. Barron's body to his English relatives, and had received a letter from them in which they seemed relieved to hear that he was dead. They thanked Mr. Wood for his plain speaking in telling them of their relative's misdeeds, and said that from all they knew of Mr. Barron's past conduct, his influence would be for evil and not for good in any place that he chose to live in. They were having their money sent from Boston to Mr. Wood, and they wished him to expend it in the way he thought best fitted to counteract the evil effects of their namesake's doing in Riverdale. When this money came, it amounted to some hundreds of dollars. Mr. Wood would have nothing to do with it. He handed it over to the Band of Mercy, and they formed what is called the Barron Fund, which they drew upon when they wanted money for buying and circulating humane literature. Mrs. Wood said that the fund was being added to, and the children were sending all over the state leaflets and little books which preached the gospel of kindness to God's lower creation. A stranger picking one of them up and seeing the name of the wicked Englishman printed on the title page would think that he was a friend and benefactor to the Riverdale people, the very opposite of what he gloried in being. End of chapter 8. The end of the Englishman.